The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across Pine Street as James Wilson walked home from the community center. At 72, his steps weren't as quick as they once were, but they still had purpose. The chess tournament had gone well, he'd placed second, not bad for the oldest player there. The small trophy tucked in his canvas bag brought a smile to his weathered face. James had walked this route for nearly 15 years, ever since moving back to his hometown after retiring from the Air Force. He nodded at Mrs. Chen watering plants on her porch, waved to the Thompson kids riding bikes in their driveway. This was his neighborhood, his home. The police cruiser rolled slowly past him, then made a U-turn. James barely noticed it until the car pulled up beside him, lights suddenly flashing. "Sir, I need you to stop right there," called a voice from the car. James paused, confused. The officer who stepped out couldn't have been more than 30, crew cut, stiff posture, hand resting near his belt. His nameplate read Brennan. "Is something wrong, officer?" James asked, keeping his voice even. Decades in the military had taught him how to speak to authority, even when that authority was younger than his uniformed shirts. "We've had reports of someone suspicious in this area," Officer Brennan said, eyes scanning James and then the bag he carried. "What's in the bag?" "Just my chess set and a small trophy from today's tournament at the community center," James explained, starting to open the bag. "Keep your hands where I can see them," Brennan's voice sharpened. James froze, feeling the eyes of neighbors watching from windows and porches. The shame crept up his neck like a hot rash. "Officer, I live just 3 blocks down. I'm a retired Air Force Master Sergeant. I'm just walking home from ID." "Now," Brennan cut him off. James slowly reached for his wallet. "I'm going to get my ID from my back pocket." As he pulled out his wallet, it slipped from his fingers. Arthritis had been bad today, and fell to the sidewalk, contents spilling out. "I said keep your hands where I can see them," Brennan shouted, stepping closer, hand now on his weapon. "I'm sorry, it slipped. My hands aren't what they used to be." James didn't bend down, didn't move. Across the street, he noticed young Tom Robinson had taken out his phone and was recording. "Turn around. Hands behind your back." "What?" "Officer, there's been a mistake." "I'm just..." But Brennan had already grabbed James's arm, spinning him around roughly. The canvas bag dropped, the small trophy breaking on the sidewalk. Pain shot through James's shoulder, an old injury from his service days. "You're resisting," Brennan said, voice tight. "No, sir, I am not resisting," James replied clearly, loudly enough for the growing number of onlookers to hear. "I am complying. This is a misunderstanding." The handcuffs clicked cold against his wrists. Down the street, James saw his neighbor Joe Washington rushing toward them. "Hey, what are you doing? That's Mr. Wilson. He lives here," Joe called out. 2 more patrol cars arrived, lights spinning colored shadows across the faces of neighbors now gathering on the sidewalk. Officer Brennan ignored the protests, reciting rights to James while leading him to the cruiser. "Check his ID. It's right there on the ground," someone shouted. Another officer picked up the scattered contents of James's wallet, looking at his driver's license, then at his military ID. He said something low to Brennan, who shook his head. "Procedure," was all James heard Brennan say. As he was placed in the back of the cruiser, James caught sight of his reflection in the window, a dignified man with gray hair at his temples, wearing a blue button-down shirt now wrinkled from the encounter. He sat straight-backed, the way he'd been taught as a young airman. The crowd had grown. Phones recorded. Voices rose in protest. "This isn't right." He walks this street every day. He's a veteran. Inside the car, James closed his eyes briefly. This wasn't the first time he'd faced unfair treatment. But at his age, after serving his country, after building a life of respect in this community, it cut deeper than he wanted to admit. As the cruiser pulled away, he opened his eyes again, looking out at his neighbors. He saw anger on their faces, confusion, and something else that bothered him more, pity. James Wilson had never wanted anyone's pity. What happened next at the station would be humiliating, the processing, the questions, the cold cell, but already, in his mind, James was thinking beyond this moment. This wasn't just about him anymore. It couldn't be. 3 hours later, James Wilson sat on the edge of his bed, staring at his hands. They weren't shaking, which surprised him. His shoulder ached where Officer Brennan had grabbed him, but it was the invisible bruising that troubled him more. The house around him was too quiet. After the noise of the police station, the radios crackling, officers talking, phones ringing, the silence felt heavy. They'd released him with a mumbled apology from a desk sergeant who couldn't quite meet his eyes. Misunderstanding was the word they used, as if that made it right. His phone buzzed again. 23 messages and counting. News traveled fast in this neighborhood. He hadn't answered any of them yet, not even the five from his daughter Lisa. As if summoned by his thoughts, there was a knock at the door. He knew who it was before opening it. Dad. Lisa threw her arms around him, nearly knocking him back. At 45, she had his same determined chin and no-nonsense eyes. I came as soon as I heard. Aren't you okay? What happened? Mrs. Turner called me and said you were arrested, in handcuffs. James gently freed himself from her embrace and walked back to his armchair, lowering himself carefully. His knees weren't what they used to be. It was nothing, he said. Nothing. Dad, there's a video. James looked up sharply. A what? Lisa pulled out her phone, tapped the screen a few times, and handed it to him. There he was, being handcuffed on the sidewalk, his chest trophy broken at his feet. The video had thousands of views already. His throat tightened. It was one thing to live through it. Another to watch it happen, to see himself treated like a criminal. Who posted this? He asked, his voice rough. That kid down the street, Tom. His mom made him take it down, but not before it got shared. Lisa sat on the arm of his chair. People are furious, Dad. The comments. Everyone knows you. The guys at the VFW are talking about organizing a protest. James handed the phone back. No protests. But, Dad. No. His voice had the old command tone from his military days. I don't want a circus. Lisa went to the kitchen and came back with 2 mugs of tea. The familiar smell of peppermint filled the room. She'd been making him peppermint tea since she was tall enough to reach the stove. You need to file a complaint, she said, sitting across from him. James sipped his tea. Through the window, he could see his garden, tomatoes nearly ready to harvest, zinnias bright against the fence. He'd built a life here, a quiet one. Now this. What good would it do? He finally asked. They'll just close ranks. They always do. This isn't like before, Dad. It's different now. People record things. They speak up. The phone rang. Then again. James ignored it. That'll be the 3rd reporter, Lisa said. The first 2 already left messages. James closed his eyes. The last thing he wanted was to be on the evening news. James Wilson, the old man roughed up by police. He could already imagine the sad music they'd play behind his story, the pitying looks. When the doorbell rang, he didn't move. I'll get it, Lisa said. He heard voices at the door, neighbors, from the sound of it. More tea appeared. Then casseroles. His small living room filled with familiar faces, Joe Washington and his wife, the Turners from across the street, Mr. Puttle from the corner store. They'd brought food and outrage and support. You should sue them, James. My cousin's a lawyer. He'd take your case for free. Disgraceful, how they treated you. Their anger washed over him, well-intentioned but exhausting. When they finally left, James stood at the window, watching them walk away in the gathering darkness. You need to decide what you want to do, Lisa said, cleaning up the dishes, but don't let them get away with this. Later that night, after Lisa had gone home with a promise to return tomorrow, James couldn't sleep. The video played in his mind on repeat, the officer's face, the handcuffs, the broken trophy. His own face, trying to maintain dignity while being humiliated. He picked up his old service photo from the nightstand. A young man in uniform stared back at him, confident, ready to take on the world. That man had faced worse than this, much worse. What would you do? He asked his younger self. The answer came slowly as the night deepened around him. This wasn't just about one afternoon, one officer, one mistake. It was about something bigger. His phone buzzed with another message. This one from an old friend who'd seen the video, a retired judge he'd known for decades. Call me, it read. We need to talk about what happens next. James set the phone down. For the first time since those handcuffs had clicked around his wrists, he felt something other than shame and anger. He felt purpose. James woke before dawn, a habit from decades of military service that retirement hadn't broken. The house was quiet, but his mind wasn't. He barely slept, turning over possibilities like stones in a river, looking for the right path forward. He made coffee and carried it out to the back porch. The morning air was cool, birds just beginning their songs. His garden needed watering. Life went on, even when it felt like everything had changed. The retired judge, Harold Turner, had been clear on the phone last night. "You've got options, James. Good ones." That officer was way out of line. James watched a cardinal land on his bird feeder, red against the green leaves of the oak tree. Beautiful, but sharp too, like anger when it's fresh. His doorbell rang at exactly 9. Harold was punctual, another military man. They'd served in different branches but shared the same understanding of duty and honor. "You look like hell," Harold said by way of greeting, his weathered face creased with concern. "Feel like it too," James admitted, letting him in. Harold carried a leather briefcase that had seen better days. He set it on the kitchen table and pulled out a legal pad already filled with notes. "I've made some calls," he said. "Got the incident report. Officer Brennan claims you were behaving erratically and failed to comply with instructions." James snorted. "I was walking home from chess club." "I know." Harold tapped his pen against the pad. "The video makes that pretty clear. That's actually good for us." "Us?" "James, I've known you 30 years. You think I'm sitting this out?" They talked through options: a formal complaint against Officer Brennan, a civil rights lawsuit against the department, media interviews to raise awareness. "It's all about what you want," Harold said, leaning back in his chair. "Justice for yourself? A settlement? Or something bigger?" James stood and walked to the window. Across the street, Mrs. Turner was watching their house while pretending to garden. 3 houses down, the Robinson boy who'd taken the video was shooting hoops, glancing over occasionally. "What would something bigger look like?" James asked. Harold smiled, as if he'd been waiting for that question. "Change," he said simply. "Real change in how they train officers, in who they hire, in how they handle situations exactly like yours." James thought about his years in the Air Force, training young recruits. How some came in full of assumptions and ego, how carefully he'd had to mold them into servicemen and women who understood true strength wasn't about power, but restraint. "I don't want to destroy that officer's life," James said finally. "Young man like that, he's got years ahead of him." "This isn't about revenge," Harold agreed. "It's about making sure what happened to you doesn't happen to someone else." The phone rang. Another reporter. James let it go to voicemail. "There'll be more of that," Harold warned. "People want to turn you into a symbol. The question is, what kind of symbol do you want to be?" James thought of the young officer's face. The fear there, masked by aggression, not so different from young airmen he'd known facing their first real test. "I want to meet with him," James said suddenly. "With Brennan?" Harold looked shocked. "James, that's not how this works. Your lawyer, which is going to be me, by the way, would advise against that. Not just him. The chief too, and whoever trains their officers." Harold was silent for a long moment. "You're not thinking of a lawsuit at all, are you?" James shook his head. "Lawsuits end with money changing hands. Nothing really changes." "So what are you thinking?" James sat back down, energy flowing through him for the first time since the incident. "When I trained young airmen, I taught them respect first. For the uniform, for civilians, for themselves. That's what's missing with this officer." He took a piece of paper and began writing. "I want to propose a training program for veterans to work with police cadets, to teach them about serving the community, not just policing it." Harold watched him, a slow smile spreading across his face. "You know this won't be easy. The department will resist. They'll say they already have training. Then we make it public. We use the video. We use my service record. We use whatever we need to get their attention." James kept writing, his hand moving faster now. Ideas that had formed during the sleepless night took shape on the page. "You're not looking for an apology," Harold realized. "You're looking for a mission." James looked up, the familiar sense of purpose he'd felt in his military days burning in his chest again. "I've got 20 years of leadership experience. Might as well put it to use." He tapped the paper. "This officer made a mistake, but the real problem is the system that trained him. That's what we need to fix. Harold nodded slowly, then reached for his phone. I know some people who can help. This won't happen overnight, James. I've got time, James said, looking out at his garden at the neighborhood beyond. And I'm not going anywhere. For the first time since the handcuffs had closed around his wrists, James Wilson smiled. Not the path he would have chosen, but maybe the one he was meant to find. 1 week after the incident, James sat in an uncomfortable chair outside Police Chief Gregory's office, waiting. His appointment had been scheduled for 10:00 a.m. It was now 10:45. The message was clear. The chief had more important things to do than meet with him. James didn't fidget or check his watch. Years of military service had taught him patience, though he couldn't help noticing the curious glances from officers passing by. Word had gotten around. He was that old guy from the video. Harold sat beside him, briefcase on his lap, occasionally clearing his throat. He'd insisted on coming along, worried that James might be too forgiving. Don't let them sweet-talk you, he'd warned on the drive over. They're hoping this will just go away. At 11:03, the chief's door finally opened. Chief Gregory was younger than James had expected, maybe mid-40s, with a carefully trimmed mustache and tired eyes. Mr. Wilson, he said, extending his hand. Sorry to keep you waiting. Busy morning. The office was neat but impersonal. Certificates on the walls, a few formal photos with city officials, nothing that hinted at the man behind the title. James took a seat across from the large desk, Harold settling beside him. I've reviewed the incident report, the chief began, folding his hands. And I want to personally apologize for any misunderstanding that occurred. Misunderstanding, James repeated, the word tasting bitter. Is that what you call handcuffing a 72-year-old veteran who was walking home from a chess tournament? The chief's expression tightened slightly. Officer Brennan was responding to a call about suspicious activity in the area. He followed protocol. No, he didn't, Harold cut in. I've read your protocols. Nowhere does it say to immediately escalate to handcuffs when dealing with an elderly citizen who poses no threat. With all due respect, sir, police work is complex. Split-second decisions. I know about split-second decisions, James said quietly. I made them for 20 years in the Air Force. The difference is, we were trained to assess threats properly. Even at the VFW hall, where James had expected solid support, opinions were divided. Look, James, what happened to you was wrong, said Bill Taylor, an Army veteran he'd known for years. But pushing too hard against the police, it's complicated, you know. My grandson just joined the force in the next county. These are tough jobs. The most disturbing moment came when James found a note on his windshield after shopping at the grocery store. Stop making trouble, or there will be more trouble. No signature, of course. He showed it to Harold, who wanted to report it immediately. And tell them what? James asked. That someone left a vague note. They'll just see it as more reason to dismiss me as a troublemaker. Lisa was furious when she found out, insisting James stay with her for a few days. He refused. I'm not leaving my home because someone wants to scare me, he told her. I've faced worse than anonymous notes. But that night, alone in his house, he found himself checking the locks twice before bed, something he'd never done before. The local news station called, wanting an interview. James declined. He wasn't interested in becoming a TV sensation. He wanted real change, not 15 minutes of fame. Harold called with worse news the following week. They're trying to discredit you, he said. Someone leaked your military record, but only the parts about that disciplinary hearing in '87. That was cleared up, James protested. My commander even wrote a commendation afterward. They're not mentioning that part, Harold said grimly. Just painting you as having a history of problems with authority. James hung up the phone and sat in his garden, watching bees move among his flowers. He'd expected resistance, but not this, not a systematic attempt to undermine his character and isolate him. For the first time since starting this fight, doubt crept in. Maybe he was too old for this battle. Maybe the system was too entrenched to change. His phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. Not everyone at the department agrees with what's happening. Some of us want to help. Meet tomorrow. James stayed at the message for a long time, weighing possibilities, risks, hopes. Finally, he typed back a single word. Where? The diner sat on the edge of town, its neon, open 24-hour sign flickering in the late afternoon sun. James arrived 15 minutes early, chose a booth in the back corner where he could see the door, and ordered coffee. Old habits. He wasn't sure what to expect or who. The text message had been vague, just a time and place. Could be a trap, could be nothing. But James hadn't survived this long by ignoring his instincts, and something told him this was important. At exactly 4:30, a young woman in civilian clothes walked in. She scanned the diner, eyes landing on James. Something in her posture, the straight back, the measured steps, told him immediately. Law enforcement. She slid into the booth across from him without introducing herself, ordered coffee from the passing waitress, then placed her phone on the table, screen up. A badge number displayed on it. Officer Diane Rodriguez. "I'm taking a risk being here," she said in a low voice. James nodded. "I appreciate that. What happened to you was wrong," she continued, stirring sugar into her coffee without drinking it. "Not everyone on the force thinks like Brennan or supports what the chief is doing." "How many is not everyone?" James asked. Officer Rodriguez glanced around before answering. "Enough. Mostly younger officers, those of us who joined to actually help people, and a few veterans like Lieutenant Molest, who's been trying to change things from the inside for years." She pulled out a small notebook, sliding it across the table. "This is a copy of the actual protocol that should have been followed during your stop. Brennan violated at least 6 departmental policies." James opened the notebook, scanning the neatly written notes. "Why are you doing this?" She looked down at her coffee. "My grandfather was a lot like you. Fought in Vietnam. Came home to a country that didn't always respect his service. He taught me that any uniform, is about protecting people, not intimidating them." She finally took a sip of her coffee. "The department has problems, Mr. Wilson. Big ones. The training is all wrong. Too focused on seeing threats everywhere, not enough on de-escalation. Some of us have been trying to speak up, but it's your job on the line," James finished for her. She nodded. "I can help you, but I can't be the face of this. Not yet." "What kind of help are you offering?" Officer Rodriguez leaned forward. "Information, support from inside, and others who will back your training program once it gains traction." For the next hour, she laid out the department's weaknesses, outdated training modules, instructors who emphasized force over communication, leadership that protected problem officers. James took careful notes, asking occasional questions. "There's something else you should know," she said as they prepared to leave. "Officer Brennan has been in trouble before. 3 complaints in 2 years, all from minority citizens, all quietly handled." James wasn't surprised, but the confirmation still stung. "And he's still on the force. On desk duty now, thanks to you. He's angry about it. Watch yourself." They left separately, James waiting 10 minutes after Officer Rodriguez departed. Driving home, his mind raced with new possibilities. This wasn't just his fight anymore. The next morning, James called Harold. "I need you to set up a meeting, not with the chief this time, with the city council." "The council?" "James, they're politicians. They'll talk in circles and—" "They're also elected," James interrupted. "And they control the police budget. Set it up." 2 days later, James sat in his living room surrounded by unlikely allies. Harold with his legal pad, Officer Rodriguez still in civilian clothes, Lieutenant Wallace, who had served in the Navy before joining the police, and 2 other young officers who'd been quietly recruited. "The chief won't change because we ask nicely," James told the group. "We need leverage. We need public support. And we need a plan that makes them look bad if they refuse it." Lieutenant Wallace nodded. "The department cares about image more than anything. Bad publicity hurts recruitment, hurts funding." "Then we use that," James said. "Officer Rodriguez has given us proof that proper protocols weren't followed in my case. We don't go to the media yet. That's our last resort. First, we approach the city council with a fully formed proposal for veteran-led training. They'll still resist," one of the young officers pointed out. "The chief has friends on the council." "That's why we need community voices," James replied, pulling out a list of names. "I've spent 50 years in this town. I know people, church leaders, business owners, other veterans, people who vote. Officer Rodriguez studied him with newfound respect. "You're building a coalition." "That's exactly what I'm doing," James said with a small smile. "Something else the military taught me. When the mission matters, you find allies wherever you can." The group worked late into the evening, crafting a strategy that went far beyond what James had initially imagined. It wasn't just about his incident anymore. It was about fundamentally changing how police officers in their community were trained and held accountable. As everyone was leaving, Lieutenant Wallace hummed back, "You know, when Rodriguez first told me about you, I thought you'd just be another angry citizen with a grudge. But you're a strategist." James shook his hand. "I'm just an old soldier who recognizes when a system needs fixing." That night, James added a new section to his proposal, a civilian oversight board that would include veterans, community leaders, and retired officers to review police training practices annually. It was bold, possibly too bold, but fortune favored the bold. Another military lesson he hadn't forgotten. The threatening note he'd received was still on his mind, but it carried less weight now. Alone in his living room, James looked at the photos of himself in uniform displayed on the wall, a young man who'd believed in serving something greater than himself. Somehow, decades later, he'd found his way back to that same purpose. His phone buzzed with a text from Officer Rodriguez. "Council meeting set for next Tuesday. Chief doesn't know we're coming. Ready." James typed back a single word. "Ready." For the first time in 2 weeks, he slept soundly through the night. The city council chambers were packed beyond capacity. Word had spread through the community. James Wilson was going to speak, the man from the video, the elderly veteran who'd been handcuffed on his own street. James sat in the front row, his proposal folder on his lap, watching people file in. Neighbors he'd known for decades, fellow veterans wearing caps that displayed their service, church members, even teenagers like Tom Robinson, the boy who'd recorded the video. Harold sat beside him, reviewing notes. "Remember, stick to the plan. Don't let them sidetrack you with details about the incident. This is about the future, not the past." James nodded, though his throat felt dry. Public speaking had never been his favorite thing, even during his military days. But some things were worth the discomfort. At the far side of the room, Police Chief Gregory entered with 2 senior officers. Their faces tightened when they saw the crowd. This wasn't the usual Tuesday night council meeting with empty seats and routine business. Mayor Thompson called the meeting to order, moving quickly through the standard agenda items. When they reached public comments, James's name was called first. The walk to the podium felt longer than it should have. James gripped his folder, feeling the weight of all those eyes on him, supportive ones from his coalition, skeptical ones from the council members, stony ones from the police leadership. "My name is James Wilson," he began, his voice steadier than he expected. "Most of you know me as a neighbor, a veteran, or recently, as the man in a video being handcuffed while walking home from a chess tournament." The room was completely silent. "I'm not here to complain about what happened to me, though it was wrong. I'm here because that incident revealed a serious problem in our community, one that affects everyone in this room." James laid out the facts, the improper stop, the escalation, the policies violated. Then he moved to the heart of his presentation. The problem isn't just one officer. It's a system that trains police to see threats instead of citizens, to escalate instead of communicate. But there's good news. We can fix this. He outlined his proposal, a training program developed by veterans and community leaders, working alongside police officers who wanted reform. A civilian oversight committee to review police training annually. A community engagement initiative that would bring officers into schools, community centers, and churches not as authorities, but as partners. "This isn't about punishment," James emphasized. "It's about progress. The kind of progress that makes everyone safer, citizens and officers alike." Mayor Thompson cleared his throat. "Mr. Wilson, while we appreciate your enthusiasm, police training is complex. These matters are best left to professionals." "Like me," James responded. 20 years training young airmen to handle life and death situations while respecting civilian authority and international law? Or perhaps like Lieutenant Wallace? At his cue, Lieutenant Wallace stood up in uniform. "I've served this department for 15 years, following 12 years in the Navy. I fully support Mr. Wilson's proposal and believe it would improve officer safety as well as community relations. The mayor's eyebrows shot up. Police Chief Gregory's face darkened. One by one, members of James's coalition rose. Officer Rodriguez and the other police supporters, veterans from the VFBO, community leaders, even Mrs. Chen from down the street, who spoke about how her grandchildren now feared walking past police. Each speaker added weight to James's argument, creating a momentum that couldn't be ignored. The council members exchanged glances. This wasn't a lone complainant, this was a movement. Chief Gregory finally approached the podium, his expression carefully controlled. While we appreciate community input, the department already has extensive training programs in place. Budget constraints make additional programs impractical at this time. That's why we've secured private funding, James countered, nodding to Harold, who stood up. The Peterson Foundation has already committed $50,000 to launch this program, Harold announced. All we need is the department's cooperation. A murmur ran through the crowd. The Peterson Foundation was a respected local charity, its support lending legitimacy that couldn't be easily dismissed. What happened next surprised everyone. Officer Brennan entered the chambers, still in uniform despite his desk duty status. A ripple of tension moved through the room as he walked straight to the podium. "I'd like to speak," he said, his voice tight. Mayor Thompson looked uncertain but nodded. Brennan turned to face James directly. "Mr. Wilson, I owe you an apology. My actions that day were wrong. I was taught to see potential threats everywhere, to take control of situations quickly. But you weren't a threat. You were just a man walking home." The room went completely still. "I spent 2 weeks on desk duty thinking about what happened," Brennan continued. "About what I could have done differently. About why I reacted the way I did." He paused, struggling visibly. "The truth is, I never received proper training in de-escalation or community engagement. Most of us haven't." He turned to face the council. "I support Mr. Wilson's proposal, not because I'm trying to save my job, but because officers like me need better training. The community deserves better from us." James watched the young officer, seeing past the uniform to the person beneath, someone capable of growth, of admitting mistakes. In that moment, all the anger he'd been carrying seemed to lift away. Chief Gregory looked stunned, then furious. But the mood in the chamber had shifted decisively. Mayor Thompson cleared his throat. "Given the unusual circumstances and the clear community support, I believe this proposal warrants serious consideration. I move that we form a committee to work with Mr. Wilson and the police department to implement a pilot program based on his recommendations." The vote was unanimously in favor. Outside the chambers afterward, people surrounded James, offering congratulations and thanks. Officer Brennan approached cautiously. "I meant what I said in there," he told James quietly. "I'm sorry for what happened." James studied him for a moment, then extended his hand. "The real test comes next, helping to build something better." Brennan shook his hand firmly. "I'd like to help if you'll let me." As the crowd dispersed, James stood on the steps of City Hall with Harold, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and purple. "So," Harold said, "not exactly what we planned, but maybe better." James nodded. "Sometimes the most unlikely people turn out to be your strongest allies." He thought about the journey that had brought him here, from humiliation to purpose, from anger to action. 1 month ago, he'd been just an old veteran playing chess and tending his garden. Now he was at the center of real change. "What's next?" Harold asked. James smiled. "Now comes the hard part, making it actually work." 6 months later, James sat at the back of the police academy classroom, watching the newest group of cadets listen to Officer Brennan. The young officer had become an unexpectedly effective teacher, sharing his own mistakes with a humility that caught the attention of even the most skeptical recruits. "The uniform doesn't make you powerful," Brennan was saying. "It makes you responsible. To the community, to your fellow officers, and to yourself." James smiled slightly. Those were his words, spoken months ago during one of their early planning sessions. Now they were becoming part of the department's culture. The Wilson Protocol, as the program had come to be known despite James's protests about the name, was in its second training cycle. What had started as a pilot program was now mandatory for all officers in the department, with other cities in the state beginning to take notice. After class, James walked with Brennan to the break room. "Good session today," he said, pouring himself a cup of coffee. Brennan nodded. "That group asks tough questions, especially the tall woman in the front row. She challenged everything I said." "That's a good thing," James replied. "We need officers who think, not just follow." The academy hallways looked different now. Photos of officers working in the community hung alongside the traditional graduation pictures. The mission statement had been rewritten with input from the Civilian Oversight Committee. Small changes, but meaningful ones. Chief Gregory had resisted at first, attending meetings with crossed arms and skeptical comments. But over time, even he had come to see the benefits. Civilian complaints were down. Officer morale was up. The local paper had run a feature on the program, bringing positive attention to a department that had grown accustomed to criticism. James checked his watch. "I need to head out. Community forum at the senior center tonight." The forums had been Lisa's idea, monthly meetings where citizens could speak directly with officers in a non-threatening environment. James moderated them, bridging the gap between the uniform and the community with his unique perspective. "Need a ride?" Brennan asked. "I've got my car, thanks." Driving across town, James reflected on how much had changed since that afternoon when he'd been handcuffed on his own street. The broken chest trophy had been replaced by a wall of thank you letters in his home office. The humiliation had been transformed into purpose. The senior center was already filling up when he arrived. Not just elderly residents, but people of all ages, young parents, teenagers, business people. These forums had become community events, drawing larger crowds each month. Tonight's topic was understanding police procedures, your rights and responsibilities during a traffic stop. Lieutenant Wallace and Officer Rodriguez would lead the discussion, with James facilitating questions from the audience. Mrs. Turner waved him over before the session began. "James, have you seen this?" She handed him a letter from the mayor's office, announcing that the Wilson Protocol was receiving statewide recognition. There would be a formal ceremony next month. "They want you to speak," she said, beaming with pride. James pocketed the letter with a nod. Public speaking was still not his favorite activity, but he'd gotten better at it over the months. Some messages were worth the discomfort of delivery. The forum went smoothly, with honest questions from citizens and straightforward answers from the officers. No defensiveness, no tension. Just community members talking to other community members, some of whom happened to wear uniforms. Afterward, as people were leaving, a young black man approached James. He'd seen him at previous forums but hadn't spoken with him directly. "Mr. Wilson, I'm Thomas Brown. My grandfather served in Vietnam." The young man shifted nervously. "I'm applying to the police academy next month. Your program is why." James shook his hand firmly. "The department will be lucky to have you." "I grew up not trusting police," Thomas admitted. "But seeing how things are changing, I want to be part of that change." This was happening more and more. Young people from communities that had historically distrusted law enforcement now seeing it as a potential career, a way to serve and improve their neighborhoods. Later that evening, James sat on his back porch, enjoying the cool night air. His garden was flourishing. Tomatoes ripening on the vine, flowers blooming in carefully tended beds. Life moving forward as it should. His phone rang. Harold calling with updates on expanding the program to neighboring counties. The work was growing, touching more communities than James had initially imagined possible. When the call ended, James remained on the porch, looking up at the stars. He thought about the journey of the past 6 months, from victim to advocate, from anger to action. So many people had joined him along the way, adding their own ideas and energy to the cause. Officer Brennan had become one of the program's most passionate supporters, channeling his regret into genuine reform. Chief Gregory had eventually come around, recognizing that changing with the times was better than being forced to change. Lisa had organized community support, turning one incident into a movement for lasting improvement. The next morning, James visited the community center for his regular chess game, the same place he'd been walking home from on that fateful day. His friends greeted him with the usual good-natured trash talk about his chess strategy, treating him not as a local celebrity but simply as James, the guy who thought too long before moving his knights. As he set up the chess pieces, James noticed a police cruiser stopping outside. Officer Rodriguez stepped out, waving to a group of children playing in the center's yard. They waved back. No fear, no tension, just normal interaction between an officer and the community she served. Small changes adding up to something significant. Not perfect. There was still work to do, still resistance to overcome, still incidents that showed how far they had to go. But progress was happening, step by steady step. James moved his first chess piece forward. Just like in the game before him, in life you couldn't change everything at once. You made one good move, then another, thinking several steps ahead while remaining flexible enough to adapt when things didn't go as planned. Your move, he told his opponent, settling in for the game, already thinking about the community meeting scheduled for tomorrow and the academy session the following day. This wasn't the retirement he planned. It was better, filled with purpose, community, and the satisfaction of seeing real change take root and grow. All because he decided that one humiliating afternoon wouldn't define him. Instead, he would use it to redefine something larger than himself. Sometimes the worst moments in life became doorways to the most meaningful chapters. As James studied the chessboard before him, he smiled at the symmetry. In chess as in life, what looked like a setback could become an opportunity, if you had the wisdom to see it and the courage to move forward.